Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome here at our faculty José Aragüez. Let me introduce him with a couple of words. José Aragüez is Adjunct Professor of Architecture at Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. He is a New York-based independent architect and writer with working experience and offices in Spain, the Netherlands, and London. He holds a Diploma in Architecture and Urbanism from University of Granada in Spain, and other degrees from Columbia and other schools. He has presented his work internationally across Europe, North America, and into the Middle East. His project, sections of which were shown at, in the year 2014 at the Venice Biennale, have received numerous awards and fellowships from institutions like the Canadian Center of Architecture and others. For the past few years, Aragüez has led an international project titled The Building that yielded 2 symposia in 2014 and a theory seminar at Cornell University in fall 2015. The project culminates in a book published by Lars Müller Publishing in November 2016, along with the related panels and launch events taking place across Europe and the United States in this year 2017. And today, Brno becomes a part of this fascinating net. So, thank you for coming and welcome, José.
All right, good. All right, thank you, Martin, for the introduction. Thank you, Peter, who's not here now. Okay, so you'll tell him later that I'm thanking him. I want him to know. For the nice invitation. I'm excited to be here in Brno for the first time. I've been in Czech Republic before, but not Brno. So I'm looking forward to learning more about the city. And yeah, all right. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about this project because you see it now as a book, but this is really a larger self-initiated discursive project that we started in 2014. And actually has 4 phases. 2 symposia that I organized that year, first one at the AA, second one at Columbia University. Then a theory seminar that I taught at Cornell in 2015. Then the actual book production, which took place throughout 2016. And then now in 2017, a series of events around the US in the spring and now around Europe in the fall, which rather than being conventional book launch, we're trying to sort of foster the conversation around the agenda and see how basically different geographies and different cultures react differently to the purpose of the project. The starting diagnosis for the project was actually rather simple. A few years back, I was starting my Ph.D. at Princeton, and on the one hand, as it became clear to me, I was becoming more and more fascinated by the intellectual expansion that I was being exposed to. At the same time, it became clear to me that there wasn't a lot of discussion on architectural design in scholarly circles in architecture. Right? So, in other words, that there wasn't a lot of architecture in architecture. So I shared this diagnosis with a number of colleagues, friends, faculty, and so on, and everybody agreed. That means there was a repressed quality to the issue. So let's bring it to the surface. Let's gather historians, theorists, PhD candidates, and architects around that which is supposed to establish a common ground for everybody, i.e. architectural thinking as a form of knowledge. Right? So this became the motto for the project. So I've put in here a few pictures of those 2 original events. So this was the one at the AA. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with those people. Basically, we managed for everybody to be there. It was more of a British style, kind of heated conversations type of debate, seminar-like. See, that's Brett Steele, director of school. said that's June 2014, so basically 5 days before the opening of Koolhaas's Venice Biennale. And this is the second one with the Columbia, more conference-like, and what we also managed forever to be, that's Stan Allen, showing some of the round tables. Bernard Schumi was in the audience, Joe Nachman, Silvio Levin, Alejandro Zarapolo. Yeah, and then putting also some pictures of the events we've done after publication of the book. So basically starting about a year ago in December 2016. So this is at the Lisbon Architecture Triennale with the director André Tavares. This is with Lars Miller, the official launch in New York. This is at MIT, also with a number of participants. You see Michael Hayes, Rafi Siegel, who had a show here in the Czech Republic, I think last year in Prague. This is one of the events with Columbia, with Dean, with Bernard Schumi again, and Stan Allen. This is in Chicago, University of Granada, Chicago. It's in LA. You're going to see kind of the typical West Coast glare going through the picture. We need Denarian Mark Lee, the director of the Chicago Biennial. So lecture at Columbia during the summer series. And back to Europe, this is EPFL in Lausanne. You see Kirsten Gears from Office and Christophe Bangeraway from EPFL. This is Madrid, Luis Fernandez Galeano, Emilio Tuñón. About 3 weeks ago, this is in Malaga, in southern Spain. This is ETH, Zurich. See Rohan Stalder, Ine Davidovici, Philip Buchbrum, Jan de Wilder. Maybe you guys are more familiar with these faces. There was this at DAA about 10 days ago or so. And at this point, what we're doing is we're trying to represent all of this graphically to have a better sense of the scope and impact of the project internationally as we keep adding up more locations. This is a matrix of as of August, so it's not updated to today, but basically with all of the contributors and to the book and participants who have spoken at some point at some of the events. Basically, the idea was to convene many, if not most, of the top thinkers in architecture internationally, while at the same time appealing to both history theory on the one hand, and on the other hand, design, culture, and practice. So percentages were about 60-40, as I'm saying, as of August. Also trying to keep track of how the graphic identity of the project changes as it gets represented in different lecture posters and event series. So this is just for the spring. All right. So and that was like a bit of an introduction to the whole project. And usually when I get to this point, what I do is I share with you guys a number of theoretical propositions that underpin the armature of the project. Yeah? So I'm not going to elaborate too much during the Q&A. If you guys have any questions, you can ask me and I can clarify. So I'm going to just articulate them relatively briefly. Yeah? First thing is, when one writes about architecture, one can reflect upon and write about many different things, right? Like different actors, layers of discourse, aspects, and so on. But despite all of that, which is very necessary, the building remains a necessary condition for a contribution to knowledge in architecture, right? So it's always there. It can be in the foreground, in the background, somewhere in the middle, but it's always there, right? That's why it's a necessary condition. That necessary condition would be different if the target weren't architecture, but were urbanism or product design or furniture design and exhibition design and so on, right? Within the design disciplines. Likewise, it would be different if the discipline was outside of design, such as sociology or ethics or political science or cultural studies and so on. Right? Within architecture, the building remains a necessary condition. Now, that distinction among fields is actually necessary in order to be able to create interdisciplinary links, right? Because you can only relate things that are different, right? That's a tautology. That's an obvious thing. You cannot relate things that are the same. Right? You need to distinguish them. But moreover, what's important here is that interactions and overlaps between different fields will only be productive if you're actually capable of accounting for the differences between those fields of knowledge. Right? because otherwise it won't be possible to really reach an accurate understanding of such interdisciplinary processes and their results. So in other words, while when we speak about interdisciplinarity, usually we tend to emphasize zones of overlap or intersections. Here the claim is that interdisciplinary processes are first and foremost rooted in difference, which is the opposite. Now, as a result of something called the theoretical turn of the 1960s, which you may have studied in class, maybe basically a moment where the discipline of architecture acquired a kind of unprecedented self-awareness of the construction of its own culture through theory, which changed basically the paradigm of how knowledge gets produced in the discipline. As a result of it, architectural history and theory started to develop relationships with non-disciplinary structures and social realms, such as philosophy, sociology, anthropology, linguistics, and so on, other fields of knowledge, through so-called mediatory concepts. Right? So concepts that belong in these other external fields, such as reification, signifier, signified, rhizome, ideology, deconstruction, and so on. Right? Now, this is how importing concepts and external concepts and applying theoretical frameworks from fields outside of architecture to architecture became a pattern, right? In something that started in the late 60s. And that pattern remains very present today. Has been present for about 5 decades. Now, a little bit later, about the mid-70s more or less, there was a parallel dynamic started by which the so-called architectural object taxons, that is the building, grew more and more stable as it started to appear in more and more different guises, like in more and more different forms. So, for example, the building as the reification of power structures, or the building as a facilitator of participatory processes, or the building as a locus for phenomenological content, or the building as a construct amenable to mirroring processes in the natural world. Right? The building as something else. Right? Now, that's not a bad thing. Right? That's a good thing. Right? That's an index for the kind of, this diversification is an index for the increasing sophistication of architecture as a field of knowledge, for sure. Right? But the question here is that if you look closely enough, the flip side of that diversification is the fact that the building itself appears more often as a medium through which to tap into concerns that, strictly speaking, belong to fields outside of architecture, if not as altogether absent, than as itself a realm of research in its own right. A medium through which to access concerns in other fields, rather than a realm of research in its own right. So, that's how the more sort of controversial claim of the project comes about, which is to say that for 5 decades, the building has been more of a means than an end within architectural history and theory. That's not perhaps what one would say when one studies history theory in school, right? Say, well, it's all about buildings, right? So here the claim is the opposite, is that it has been a means to an end, but not an end. So, the idea here is to, with this project, is not to overturn these two tendencies, right? Not to turn them around, right? Because that would be undesirable and, frankly, it would be naive, right? But to try to balance them out a little bit, right? To try to kind of see if we can shift the focus a little bit to the other side of the equation, right? And that's how the twofold agenda for this project gets established. So on the one hand, to discuss what it means for a building to embody a historically significant contribution in terms of a design aspect, or a concept relevant to the reading of buildings in general. Historically significant contribution, right? Not all buildings that get designed in contemporary practice achieve that condition of being historically significant. Yeah? So what it is that makes them historically significant, if at all? That would be the first part of the agenda. The second part of the agenda, a little bit more ambitiously, is to say, well, let's see if there are ways in which buildings can venture terms or theoretical frameworks which could potentially reach fields of knowledge outside of architecture, external to architecture. Yeah? That's a little bit more ambitious, but we want to test whether that's possible to do through the building. So, in other words, the project appeals to architecture specificity in order to expand its limits and audiences. It appeals to that which is specific to architecture and try to reach outside, as opposed to withdrawing into its own autonomy, withdrawing into its own interior. Yeah? And here's when a distinction between autonomy and specificity makes itself felt naturally. Yeah? So I'm going to proceed to I don't know how familiar you guys are with the tradition of the autonomy project. And I have a lot of time to kind of talk about it, but we're going to proceed step by step, slowly to reach this distinction between autonomy and specificity. Yeah, we can elaborate later during the Q&A if you guys are interested. First is to say that a building is not only form, right? This is one of the things that makes sense to say in a context like the US, in America, but that I think here in Europe, you guys say, well, that's of course the case, right? I mean, we know the building is not only form, right? A building is, at the very least, a combination of form and program, right? At the very least. And if you want to put it in slightly more general terms, you can say, well, the building is something like a three-dimensional material construct made up of a number of elements and relations. Yeah? So usually we tend to call form, which is arranged in such a way that is capable of housing a set of human or human-related activities. Yeah? So what we tend to call program. Now, there can be a lot of debate as to whether that type of definition is capable of encompassing everything that we understand as a building or not. And we can also discuss this later if you guys are interested, because it's deliberate that it leaves open some terrain for speculation. Yeah? Then, in architecture, as opposed to other fields, it happens to be crucial to distinguish between so-called discursive knowledge and representational knowledge because of the nature of the discipline. Right? So what's discursive knowledge in a traditional sense, in a classical sense? So for those of you who are perhaps a little bit more familiar with philosophy, you will know that discursive knowledge is basically just the kind of knowledge that involves premises, narratives, inferences, judgments, ideas, concepts, conclusions, right? As they are channeled through thought and expressed through language. Right? Channeled through thought and expressed through language. Right? That's the way discourse proceeds in our mind, basically. Right? So that's fundamentally different from representational model, which is the kind of knowledge that proceeds through images, drawings, and models. Yeah? And which is crucial in architecture, is defining in architecture, and actually not only in architecture, but in all of the design practices, yeah? Such as, for example, graphic analysis or illustration. They also make use of so-called representational knowledge. Right? So, insofar as the book, the building is not a building, it's a book, right? The project is about discursive knowledge, it's not about representational knowledge, right? It's not a building, right? However, what you see on those pages are attempts to mobilize representational knowledge in order to produce discursive knowledge. Right? That's a specific of architecture, and perhaps, again, other practices which are also interested in writing about something that becomes realized in the empirical world, such as art, for example, also would sort of appeal to this combination. Therefore, architectural thinking would be something like the practice of producing discursive knowledge through the analysis, discussion, conceptualization of two inextricably bound domains. The domain of the design process, right, which as a subset of architectural thinking we might call architectural design thinking, and that of the outcome of such a process, which is to say, the building. Right? The practice of producing discursive knowledge out of the discussion of these two domains would amount to something like architectural thinking. Therefore, architectural thinking would be a distinct domain of discursive knowledge, whose attributes reach well beyond form and aesthetics, right? This is also something that in Europe, I think you guys, most of you will say, well, that's something that I know, yeah, that's more or less obvious. In the US, when you tend to focus on something like the building or the object, they'll tend to associate that with a return to form or return to aesthetics, right? And that is not the case, right? So at the very least, I'm not going to sort of enter into the nitty-gritty, the philosophical nitty-gritty of the thing, because I think it would make it a little bit too heavy. But basically, it's at least relatable to, as I say, their ontology, yeah, the being of the thing, the being of the building, technology, the medium through which the building actually gets materialized, logic, because design is a synthetic process, right? So it forces you to bring together a number of aspects of different nature into something that converges, right? That follows a particular goal. And phenomenology, because basically materials produce effects and phenomena in the scene that they get realized, right? All right, so now we're ready to kind of distinguish between these two things, right? So again, I'm not so sure how familiar you guys are with this project of autonomy, but basically this was an attempt around the late 60s and through the 70s via an Italian group of architects on the one hand and an American group of architects on the other hand in parallel, right, in different ways, to basically reduce architecture, right, to a kind of itselfness, basically rooted in the essence of form. Right? It was a formal reduction, right? In order to produce a kind of watertight, immanent, self-referential are the terms that I use usually, right? A kind of thing closed off in itself, which would be capable of falling outside of time. Right? It's a formal reduction to turn architecture into something that you can make timeless or fall outside of time. Right? So why is architectural thinking not autonomous by definition? Right? First, because architecture is not only form, right? As I said earlier, right? It's at least a combination of form and program. Therefore, formal reductions of that sort, formal reductions which reduce architecture to itself, are only a methodological option, right? But they are not written into architecture's own constitution. Yeah? They're just an option, really. Second, because the pursuit of timelessness or universals is also another option, but it's not necessarily something that needs to happen. Why? Because buildings are, by definition and by existence, bound to a particular historical time. They're bound to the time in which they are designed and built. Right? And that fact triggers the pursuit of historical knowledge, which is the opposite of universals and timelessness, as a matter of course. And then third, because architectural thinking is not some closed-off epistemological field, right? It's not something unto itself through which to view reality, but it's actually related to other fields and to culture at large. Right? It's a porous domain of knowledge. Right? However, architectural thinking is specific. Right? Why is it specific? Because the processes involved in the conception and construction of buildings and the characteristics of the outcome, right, they exhibit a number of particularities that make them fundamentally different from those of a piece of music or a novel or a painting or a film or any number of other creative practices, right? Notwithstanding the analogies that you can establish a posteriori between those mediums. Right? So, to put it in short, basically, autonomy, the original project of autonomy was rooted in specificity, to be sure. Right? But specificity, the fact that architectural thinking is a specific mode of thinking, does not imply that it is also autonomous. Right. So basically the attempt with this project is to capitalize on this combination of specificity and non-autonomy in order to produce, and this is like the key sentence perhaps of the whole project, in order to produce a kind of knowledge which is architecturally specific and yet generalizable. Right? It is rooted in the specificities of architectural thinking and yet capable of being applicable outside the boundaries of the discipline. Alright, so that was the more theoretical part, which I usually do in the beginning in order not to lose too many people. Now the second part of the presentation is more ritual. So bear with me. So just to tell you a little bit about the structure of the book is nowhere near as abstract. I mean, there's some of that kind of abstraction in the introduction, or maybe one or two essays, but basically it's much more approachable. There are 30 case studies that are classified under 6 labels. You see there: elements, halls, content, context, and reference, and technology. And basically the idea with these categories is that they are at the same time central to architecture, but also elemental enough to be able to be relevant to fields outside of architecture, right? To kind of go with the purpose of the project. Right? So that constitutes the first and main section of the whole book. 30 case studies, buildings built or designed within the last 25 years, through which the authors were asked to tackle this twofold agenda that I briefly explained earlier. And then there is a second section with longer critical essays on the question of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge, partly through reflections on the rest of the material. So that was important to kind of get the essays in the book sequentially so that they speak to each other. Right? So we got the 30 short texts first, then we asked respondents to write about those texts. Then we asked 5 extra authors to write the longer essays, in turn addressing the 30 shorter essays plus the responses. And then finally we got the last section, which are 5 short essays also addressing the importance of this renewed interest in the building in the context of architectural education today. Alright, so what I do here in the second half of the lecture with images is I share with you 5 examples from the book which speak to the first part of the agenda, and then another 5 examples which speak to the second part of the agenda. So in terms of buildings that embody a historically significant contribution in terms of a design aspect or a concept relevant to the reading of buildings in general, this is, for example, Penelope Dean writing on Fujimoto's Any House. She says a number of things. I just pick 3. One is that, and I think it's relevant since we are here in the birthplace of Adolf Loos's. She argues that this, what Fujimoto does here is that she evacuates the wall, she removes the wall from Adolf Loos's round plan, right? And in doing so, he creates this platform plan instead. Right? So it's just like the round plan minus the wall. Right? That's one reading. Then second reading is to say that the size of the platforms are so small that they approximate the size of the furniture that rests on them, and even actually perform like furniture. Right? So there's basically a blurring of the boundary between architectural elements of the building and the furniture itself. And then the third thing I think interesting that she says is that she relates this building to early 20th century architecture, modern architecture, and she says that while early 20th century modern architecture attempted to discard, to eliminate the room, the idea of the room, only to reinstate the vertical divider in new vices, new forms, movable panels, walls that appear here and there, kind of disconnected in the idea of the free plan. Right? Here, the opposite is the case, right? So here, the principle of the room is kept, and what is removed entirely is the vertical divider, which is instead replaced by these offsets between the different platforms with the nominal thickness of partitions. So it is as though Fujimoto had flipped modern architecture sideways in a way. Yeah? So he had kind of turned the vertical divider 90 degrees and turned it into a horizontal partition. Yeah? So that's what I meant by a building that embodies a historically significant contribution. Right? That you are capable of placing this building within a longer lineage, right? Within the history of architecture, and illustrate the way in which this building adds something new. Right? That's only for those of you who are going to become practicing architects. This is the single most ambitious thing to accomplish. Right? Single most ambitious thing. Right? Much more difficult than for the building to be beautiful, for the building to be functional, for the building to be sustainable, is to actually do all of that, which should be taken for granted if you're a good architect. And on top of that, to do something that actually adds something new to the history of architecture, which requires of you that you know the history of architecture well enough to be aware of exactly the one thing you're adding to it, and therefore use the term new deliberately and with substance, as opposed to completely empty. Second example, a little bit easier still. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the Travel House by Ensemble Studio. Basically, because on this case is from the AA, he argued that this house wasn't designed, but instead what was prescribed was the process of its construction. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically the idea is to dig up a hole in the earth, fill it up with hay, pour concrete around, remove earth, have a calf eat away at the hay, thereby generating the space inside. That's the idea. So usually what happens when you use poor concrete is that you put in place a very elaborate design for the cast in order to remove as much as possible, actually to control as much as possible the final appearance of the concrete. Right? So here the opposite is the case, right? This kind of intentional roughness to the technique which confers to the building a kind of unpredictability. Right? So in other words, the cast here is used to introduce uncertainty as opposed to certainty, right? Which is what typically is supposed to do. It introduces uncertainty. Okay, John Motor writing on MVRDV's Expo 2000 Dutch Pavilion. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the so-called 1901 theorem as identified by Ramkujas in Delirious, New York, which is that image on the right. So basically this massive steel structure supporting these suburban house plots, right? Plots, which are supposed to represent the idea that you can have independent plots within the same building, right? So that's the way he saw the typical Manhattan skyscraper, right? So here what John says about MVRDV's pavilion is that whereas in the 1901 theorem version, what was privileged was the semantic and environmental autonomy of every floor. Right? They were separate. Right? Here, the separations are reconsidered in terms of how the whole building would operate as an ecological mechanism. Right? So the surplus and deficiencies of one level in terms of air, heat, water, light, and so on are utilized on another, right? Which means what formerly was autonomous is here reconnected. Right? And in becoming reconnected, basically, in John's words, what happens is that the pavilion's open structure materializes a principle of interconnection through separation. Right? Interconnection through separation. Now, this is interesting because this has a lot to do with one of the earlier slides that I showed having to do with interdisciplinary processes. Right? The fact that here, the different levels are also different, right? They are clearly very different, and yet they are connected, right? Which means there is a particular kind of connection which is only meaningful if you actually know well the differences of the elements that are being connected. Right? So, combination of connection, yeah? Integration and separation at the same time. This is very easy. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Sameness Mediatek by Toyo Ito, and so here Juan Antonio Cortez from El Croquis says that this is basically a case of free plan, right? Because plates, skin, and structure are independent from one another. That's a typical case of free plan. But in relation to the Maison Domino, yeah, so the original kernel of the free plan, what happens here is that the concrete mass columns are replaced with these hollow clusters of little tubes which house the vertical flows. Right? So that's the contribution to the lineage again. Right? And then last, Marc Frochot from ETH Zurich, writing on the Sameness Project Center, he says that the contribution here gravitates around what he calls the management of threshold, which I think is a beautiful phrase to describe it. So basically, instead of having walls to separate the different soundscapes within a building, here these walls are replaced with 18 arches in pretension, a floating script so that you can actually build it, yeah? And a carpet, that together enable these long topographical thresholds, right? These kind of artificial horizon lines within the building that create these slow transitions between different acoustic environments. Yeah? So from spaces for verbal exchange to spaces for total silence to study and work. So on top of that, basically the topography itself subsumes the idea of a seat and functions like a giant sofa. Right? So I'm not going to tell you a lot more about it. Basically, along with other strategies involving lighting, like natural lighting and this strategic positioning of the patios, he comes to the conclusion that this management of thresholds operates on a number of different levels at the same time. Yeah? So it's energetic, it's distributional, and it's performative at the same time. Right? That's where the contribution of this building lies. Okay, and this is the one that's a little bit more ambitious, which is to say, well, let's see if buildings can themselves not materialize a design concept that has already been like in the mind of the architect and actually has triggered the design of the building. That's what we all do when we design, right? No. Let's see if we can actually create a concept by reading a building a posteriori, yeah? So once it exists. And let's see if that concept or that term or that framework or that theory can actually be meaningfully applicable to a field outside of architecture. So 5 hints to that. For example, Stan Allen writing on Massina Tugnon's Mossack building in Leon, a beautiful building built about 10 years ago. He says that the project's accomplishment is not so much to resolve contradictions or make didactic statements as it is to suspend and dissolve apparent oppositions. So if you take this statement, extract it away from the reading of the building and kind of leave it hanging there on its own, you realize that, especially if elaborated on, if enlarged, it could be perfectly applicable to realities, situations, and discursive problems outside of architecture. It is abstract enough while at the same time says something, points to something specific. This is one of the most interesting ones, I think, according to the responses I've been getting everywhere. Etienne Santiago from Harvard, writing about the typical suburban American house, he says that this type of house is just a prototype, so it could be any, this type of structure, relies on a novel way of thinking how a set of things, right? So not only rooms, but also people, information, objects, anything, can be organized, linked, systematized. Now, the resulting space, he calls it super urban, and in his view, I mean, he kind of argues to it, I'm just simplifying here quite a bit, but he says that this type of super urban space challenges received ways of conceiving of boundaries and connections among various elements. Whatever the element, not all the rooms, right? Whatever the element means that basically what Etienne is doing here is that he's seeing an epistemological model, which is to say he's seeing a particular way of looking at reality and understanding reality, whatever that reality is, he's finding it into an organizational model which is specifically architectural. Right? So you see the process, right? You read the model into a building and then abstract it into something which reaches beyond the origin, right? Beyond what it started, in this case, architecture. Another very interesting concept, in my view, this idea of architectural sameness. I'm not sure if you've heard such a thing before, but basically Amanda Rizzo-Lawrence argues that there's been a surge of interest over the past 5 or 6 years in a number of terms such as replica, copy, derivative, plagiarism, commentary, and so on. Which kind of gravitate around this idea of sameness, and she says there's a lack of a theoretical framework through which to distinguish these, related and yet different concepts. But to me, what's really interesting about this is that this idea of sameness, in an architectural sense, could be relevant and applicable to fields like art history or photography, or even all the way to metaphysics, right? Where they've been dealing with the problem of identity and difference for many years. Fourth, Alexander Bouguy, also from the AAA, picks OMA's Dubai Renaissance and comes up with this concept of iconology as opposed to iconicity. Right? And she says that this building, in her view, is capable of absorbing and in turn projecting any meaning. Right? It's capable of absorbing, it's an absolute exterior that is capable of absorbing and then in turn projecting any meaning. So if you think of a counterexample, let's say the Birkin in London by Norman Foster, that would be the opposite, right? Because the volumetric profile of the building is so inflected, is so specific, that in theory, I mean, it's kind of more or less accurate to say that you can only come up with a relatively few number of metaphors, such as the Birkin itself, or a dildo, or whatever resembles the actual profile of the Birkin building. Right? Here, there's a kind of abstraction that, especially in contrast to all of the buildings around it, compare to the project this type of semantic instability. Yeah? So that's exactly what she means by iconolatry. The fact that a building's iconic condition can be determined by its unstable semantic identity as opposed to a more stable semantic identity. Right? So why is this instability important? Because in 21st century late capitalism, such as today, basically there is a kind of obsession with the proliferation of images, right? And this rapid proliferation of images create a kind of domain where this instability reigns, actually, which is more the rule than the exception. Right? So in this situation, this type of business becomes the epitome. Right? It embodies this contemporary condition very well, right? Which is why this idea of iconolatry, in her view, is relevant to today. So for folks out there working on questions of meaning and representation, which in turn reverberate with politics and economics and a number of other things, something like iconolatry would be extremely important. Right? And then last, Benjamin, who's a philosopher, that's why there's no image there, and this is a little bit more abstract, but basically to put it in a nutshell, he distinguishes between two buildings within every building. Yeah? So building in regular typeface and then building in italics. Building in regular typeface would be a number of networks of relations that are external to the building and precede the conception and construction of the building, what's out there prior to the building, versus building in italics, which would be the internal network of relations which are embodied in the building and are purely disciplinary, such as materials, programs, circulation, and so on. So he says that these two sets of networks need to be thought in relation to one another. And more specifically, the second one, the one that's internal to the building, needs to be capable of reconceptualizing, reconfiguring. The way he puts it is basically is supposed to other the global, to turn it into something other than what used to be before the building was there. Because it's impossible to stand counter to it, to sort of materialize an opposition to that which preceded the building, but it is possible that a building reconfigures or reconceptualizes that which pre-existed the building itself. So that's what he called countermeasure. So for him, buildings should be countermeasures to the global condition preceding the building. Again, this is like extremely kind of a bit confusing and abstract, but we will need to talk about it a little bit longer, but you're interested in later. Anyway, so about to wrap up, I usually show this image with 60 concepts pertaining to architectural thinking. This is just to say that if you pick up a microscope and zoom into your skin, you realize that what you see as a relatively simple color, more or less homogeneous, has a lot of complexity to it. So if you look close enough, you realize that there is a kind of implosion. Right? There is an expansion from within. Right? So that's the first type of expansion that we were after with this project, right? To express as accurately as we could the nuances and the many concepts that pertain to architectural thinking. It cannot be reduced to something like spatial thinking in the abstract. It's much more rich, it's much more nuanced. Right? And second, that you can imagine if you picked 2 or 3 of them, or even more, or just one, you could actually turn that into a theoretical framework, or even more ambitiously, a system of thought, which could be meaningfully relevant to fields outside of architecture. Right? That would be the second type of expansion. Right? So there's a double expansion going on here. One from within, an implosion, and one that is in to out, right? From the inside out. And while I show you some of the pages of the book to wrap up, just to say that in attempting to grow architecture's discursive capacities from within, and then ignite its capacity to expand its limits and audiences, that is exactly the way in which we believe that we could bridge the sphere of history theory on the one hand, the sphere of thinking and discourse, and the sphere of design, culture, and practice on the other hand. And that for that to be effective at all, as is pointed out in a couple of essays in the book, for the building object strategy to work, the current history theory project would have to be extended, right? Would have to be expanded, which is the opposite of what it seems, right? Because it seems like if a kind of focus on the building is a narrowing down, it's a kind of contraction, right? But it's the opposite, right? It would entail to take it all the way, it would take a kind of expansion, extension. And so that's it. Yeah, thank you.